Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Football Giants. I am John Schmeelk. We are joined by former Giants offensive lineman Roman Oben. Roman, I will let you give your title. You work for the NFL now in the league office. You got the shield on your chest there. We can see it. Uh, First, tell the folks what you're doing and what you're up to, and then the myriad of things that you're responsible for, and we'll kind of go through all of them.
So my official title now is Vice President Football Development. So I currently deal with a lot of the strategy behind the college to pro pathway, from informing FBS coaches about some of the policies and working with the NCAA, the All-Star games. We see each other Senior Bowl every year, Senior Bowl, East West Shrine Bowl, working with the Combine on player performance. And then I had a start in actually 10 years ago. It was January of 2015 in health and safety. So we were dealing with a lot of the youth football issues, concussions, the negative health and safety narrative, and more importantly, how clubs could do a lot in their communities to highlight football participation, celebrate coaches, and all that. So it's I've had a myriad of responsibilities, as you mentioned, but I'm really happy about the work that I get to do and the people that I get to work with. And obviously, we got our local clubs right in our backyard with you guys and obviously the Jets as well.
For sure. All right. So why don't we start then with the All-Star games because those just happened. We'll talk about the Combine and then we'll kind of go from there, Roman. So let's go first. The All-Star games, they just happened. What kind of impact is the league having on those two games? How they're run? What are you guys trying to achieve? We saw the rule change last couple of years with the underclassmen being able to go to the games. We've seen the rule change this year, where if you attend these games, you have to play, right? That was a rule that kind of got put in this year as well. So just tell me about the direction you're trying to take these games to help that college to pro pathway.
Well, the first thing you mentioned was this was the first year where there were no rule changes in terms of the coaching staff from the prior year. So in the old days, if you had the lowest record and you were retained, you had to coach the Senior Bowl. And then the East-West game had a blended staff, if you will, of just different coaches from every club based on club nominations. Now, across both games, you have a blended staff. So we've got to get down to about 125 submissions from GMs and coaches across the league, to down to about 65 slots between the head coaches, offensive coordinators for both games, and obviously special teams coaches as well, which you're seeing a trend maybe with some special teams coaches being head coaches in some of these all-star games because they know both sides of the ball. They know all the personnel. They know all the back end of the roster. So it's been a good change. I mean, I think it's important to talk about like club equity, make sure all the clubs are represented. But there is a process. So Joe Schoen, Andy Berry from the obviously GM of the Browns. There were two other GMs. One wasn't retained, and one was still in the playoffs. So it would have been four general managers plus Rod Graves, who's head of Fitz Pollard Alliance. So a push towards minority coaches, a push towards just advancement in a lot of those areas. So if you're the D-line coach, you get to be the defensive coordinator. If you're the running backs coach with the Giants, you get to be offensive coordinator. So those are the kind of things that we've done. And coaches are able to do something they don't do during the year. And most likely, you're going to coach a guy that you end up drafting because now you get to stand on the chair saying, "I worked with this guy for a week. This is how we approach the meetings. This is how we approached all those interviews." It's a long schedule, but it's a part of the journey that they're constantly evaluating these kids in terms of who will best fit a roster or a draft selection or even a free agent.
So, Roman, real quick, just to stay with the coaches, but before we get to the players, how does that committee of the GMs and the president of the Fritz Pollard Alliance, how do they actually go about selecting the coaches? Do they get a list of recommendations from teams? Like, how does that process actually go down?
Yeah, so all teams that are not in the teams that have been eliminated from the playoffs will all vote, and you'll get a last minute vote from the teams that got bounced out for the wild card round. So they'll nominate someone for potential head coach who comes from the coordinator ranks, potential coordinator who comes from whether a position coach ranks or a quarterback receiver coach becomes an offensive coordinator, and then they nominate assistants. So your assistant D-line coach would be nominated for like a D-line coach, for example.
Right.
Angela Baker for the Giants has been the last 2 years, so she's an example of someone that gets to coach. She got to coach tight ends this year at the Senior Bowl. So
James
once the
Ferentz,
head
same
coach,
deal, right? James Ferentz is the assistant O-line coach here. He was the full-time O-line coach at the Senior Bowl.
yeah, and I worked with him for a week, and we talked about some. We can talk about that a little bit, but yeah. So once the head coaches and coordinators are decided, then then me and a few staff, we actually personally select the position coaches. So we go down the list, we look at coaching experience. I mean, you have a lot of NFL coaches that coached in college for 8, 9 years, and then they come to the NFL and they're assistant D-line or assistant position coaches. So they actually have coaching experience, just not a lot of long NFL experience. So going back to coach college all-stars is actually it's a plus for them. So we look at college experience, we look at guys like Mike Adams, former NFL players that are going into coaching right away. Mike, I know him very well. I know his family, from Patterson, New Jersey, and a lot of things he's done in the community back home when he's playing on other teams. But to see him coaching, last year he coached special teams. This year he coached DB. So there's always a tie into guys that coach in college, guys that played in the NFL potentially, and just getting them to coach in a way that they're not coaching during the week, during the regular season.
All right, so that's the coaching side of it. Let's talk about the player side of it. How are you trying to enhance the scouting process and the player evaluation standpoint of everything, so these players can really show their best for the teams, coaches that are coaching them, and the scouts and front office personnel that are watching them and meeting with them in meetings during the week?
Yeah, well, I would say first of all, I mean, Jim Nagy does a great job from a Senior Bowl perspective of running a good ship. I mean, there's a lot of GMs, a lot of head coaches that show up during the week to watch those practices. From a player standpoint, he does a good job, getting the players there, and you have a high percentage of guys that have been drafted from the Senior Bowl specifically. I think from my perspective, in terms of quality, I look at the O line and D line, the one-on-one matchups, and we've tried to make sure that the film angles and the competition is more about highlighting what you do well. A lot of these players and today's players, a lot of them will show up at the Senior Bowl, and you're just reading your weaknesses on your draft reports, and there's a lot of anxiety, and you're saying, listen, guys, like you're here because you're a good football player. You may be playing next to a guard that you've never played next to, most likely. You saw some guys like LSU had multiple offensive linemen, so there are always going to be schools like that, but typically you're there to have a good week and just to start that journey. And so I specifically talked to O-line and D-line coaches about how to manage that week, how to manage anxiety, how are they in the meeting room, how are the players receiving what they're learning. I mean, you're putting in a new system in 2 days, you're practicing and you're just seeing guys get better. And how do they respond in that situation? So the perimeter guys, I mean, it's the same drills. They play man, they can't blitz. I mean, it's the same type of thing you would do in an all-star game, but the lineman specifically, you're working with the guy right next to you you've never worked next to is something of a challenge, but you get to see how guys respond in that situation.
Yeah, no question about it. And the other rule I want to bring up to you, I know a rule got put out this year where I think if they're attending one of these games, the players have to participate in it, correct? Barring an
Yeah.
injury.
Yeah.
What was the reason behind that rule, and do you think it was effective?
Well, I think there was a notion that, and I think maybe it was coming from agents, and I don't talk to a lot of agents about this, that a guy can show up to an all-star game and not have to work out if he's a top pick or if he's could perceivably be like a top 30 guy. And I think it really takes a spot. One, it takes a spot away from, and I always use a proverbial like a kid from Eastern New Mexico
Right.
who goes in the fifth round that people don't care about. That guy would have showed up and solidified himself or maybe moved up. But now you're taking spots away from guys. But legitimate injury, it makes all the sense in the world. But this is an opportunity to compete, to get evaluated, to see how you are in real time. I mean, a lot of GMs and head coaches haven't physically seen these players before. Maybe you've read about it and you watch them on film, but you get to physically see a guy. And there'll be a lot of interview opportunities, 30 visits, the combine, your pro day. There'll be a lot of other opportunities, but for the integrity of the All-Star game being a chance to compete, that's why that memo went out.
Huddle up, get in here. If you're lined up here, you gotta go over the middle with it to score.
Right. How do we make that happen?
I don't know.
But Citizens does.
Make sense of your money with Citizens, official bank of Eli Manning.
Giants Huddle Podcast is brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. From game day celebrations to your everyday financial needs, Big Blue fans can get the most out of every moment with Citizens. Learn more at citizensbank.com/Giants. What are some of the things that you're still trying to look to improve in these games, and maybe future adjustments or just other things you're trying to achieve through this All-Star game process for the prospects?
I think when you look at a roster, and there's always talk about like the back end of a roster. Look at the new kickoff rule that was implemented this year. I think that's something next year you put the new kickoff in the All-Star game. You get players to start thinking about how can I make a team if I can do the new kickoff. Punt return is universal across the board, but the new kickoff rule, for example, any new rules like that, any things that you want to try. But again, the rules of the game are pretty vanilla, but you're looking for special teams guys. You're looking for guys that are highly productive from a scout's perspective, but may just come in as a special teams developmental guy. But that fifth round pick and sixth round pick is just as valuable as a first and second round pick because that's the majority of your football team. So we're always sensitive to how coaches can better evaluate, and that new kickoff rule would be an advantage, probably which would go into next year. So I'm giving you a little secret sauce here.
No, I like that, Roman. Good stuff. So when you take a look at these rosters and how they're constructed, how do you think the rule worked? Being the second year was in there, allowing underclassmen to come. Do you think they're becoming more willing to come to these games? Did you think the participation from the underclassmen was where you wanted to be? Do you want to try to entice more guys to come and play? How do you think that adjustment over the last 2 years has gone?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing over the last 2 years is there's less and less underclassmen coming out. And because of NIL and because of, I mean, I've seen numbers where it was 110, 120 underclassmen, I believe, in 2021, 2022. Last year, there were only 54 underclassmen that came out. This year, I think there were 33 that were true underclassmen, which means they graduated from high school 3 years ago. And you had maybe another 15 or so redshirt juniors that had graduated. So they're true seniors, but they're just redshirt juniors with a degree in 3.5 years. So I think if a player thinks he needs to be evaluated and gets the invite, I think you have to compete. And I think what we have to do a better job is identifying that as soon as possible. And then some of the challenges are obviously, number one, a later college national championship. I think you had two juniors between Notre Dame and Ohio State that came out early. And so those guys most likely weren't going to play in the national championship. So you just want to get the information sooner so you can do logistics sooner because you've got to go on with the head coach selection and all those other things. But I think juniors playing all-star games is a plus because teams get to see them actually play football. And it's not just, what they call the underwear Olympics from January through March, running 40s and all that non-football things. And the interviews and the medical obviously important. But it's been good to see juniors play in the game, especially the ones that are declared and that they want to play in the game.
So let me hit rewind a little bit more. So before these guys get to the All-Star games, these underclassmen have to decide if they want to come out, right? How does that process work with getting advice in terms of, what round they might go in? Does it make sense for them to come out? How involved are you in that? And how does that process work as you try to advise some of these college kids as to whether or not they should come out? Because now I think, to your point, Roman, the choice of remaining in college for these kids that have financial issues is a lot more viable, right? Because you can stay, get an NIL deal, you can get paid, and you can stay in college. So how does that process go about with you guys advising these kids as to, when they could potentially be drafted and whether or not it makes sense for them to come out at all as underclassmen?
Well, the first thing you said is right. It's no longer a hardship case for a player to come out early for financial reasons because these players, a lot of players may have up to $1 million in their pocket in college. So that's why you've seen the less of juniors coming out. We work with our management council staff. That's Ken Fiore and his team. There's a thing called a CAC evaluation, CAC, College Advisory Committee evaluation, where you can submit it in December. Where would I go if I was going to get drafted? I think about 100 players a year submit that. And they tell you that you're a first, second round pick or stay in school. It used to be you go in the first 3 rounds or we recommend you coming back a year. Up until probably 2 years ago, when with the NIL, it was probably 88 to 90% accurate. Josh Allen from the Bills sweared by it because had he left a year early, he wanted to leave Wyoming a year early. He might have been a late first rounder, maybe a second rounder, maybe not gone to an organization like the Bills. But comes back a year later, mature. He's a top 10 pick. I can't remember where he went in the draft that year, but it works for people like that. Again, now with NIL, it's different, but there is a process that players have to go through their school, submit their names, and then in that month of December, between the last college weekend, November 30th, into that conference weekend, first weekend December, through the end of December, players will know where they stand. I think there's a world now where they use that CAC evaluation to say, all right, maybe now I can get an NIL deal because the NFL says I'm a top 3 pick and I'm coming back next year to get more money. So we're always evaluating the relevancy of the CAC evaluation and what it does, where it lands in the future. And again, there's a general manager's advisory committee, there's a college advisory committee, and all that thing is everything's presented, the committee decides, and then all teams vote on any of those major changes.
That makes sense. All right, and then you also have to decide what one of these prospects get to go to the combine. There's a limited number of spots. You can only have so many players. There's only so much time to do drills and all that stuff. How does that process work in determining which players get combine invites and which guys don't?
Well, Jeff Foster, who runs the NIC, which is the combine is technically the National Invitational Camp. That's technically the name for it. So people will call it NIC. I think teams vote early. I think there's a mid-year vote. Typically, your top 100 guys are pretty easy to detect those guys. They've been highly productive in college. They've been All-Americans probably since sophomore, junior year. Those are pretty easy to detect. And then there's a later round vote. And I think you need X number of votes. Let's say you need 25 out of 32 votes of teams saying, yes, this person has at least a mid-round grade. And if you don't get if you meet that threshold, you get in. If you fall below that threshold, you don't get an invite. And then some years it's positional depth. So I think last year you had 70 offensive linemen at the combine. At 320, that's a lot of offensive linemen. You're talking 20% is just one position. This year you're going to have a high number of defensive linemen
Right.
in the combine. So and those numbers obviously will get revealed to the clubs at the appropriate time. But just from what I'm hearing, but so it's not a secret. It's not a big secret sauce about that process. But it just depends on the year, positional depth. And you hear this all the time. Hey, this is a deep year for quarterbacks, or this is a deep year for receivers, or teams that can still get a value guy in the third round at that position. You don't have to get a top 20 guy to get the best guy that fits in your club. So again, Jeff Foster does an amazing job. I'm on the combine board, along with Ronnie Barnes, Katie Blackburn, owner of the Bengals, John Spanos, and a few others, Reggie Scott, athletic trainer for the Rams. So we focus on player experience, assessment test, the player advisory committee, just some of the things that continue to evolve based on how today's athlete needs to be best prepared to do well when they get to Indy. I mean, athletes want to do well when they get to Indianapolis. They want to interview well. They want to test well. Agents want the answers to the test so none of their clients do poorly in anything. But it's not a perfect science, but at least it's pretty good thus far. Also, I will say, John, that there's probably up to 30 guys that get drafted every year that didn't go to Indy.
Yeah.
So I think that shows that nothing's perfect. And some teams have their own method of how they evaluate guys. You might get a Division II guy that's highly productive, that ends up getting drafted in the 6th round, that a lot of people that didn't get a combine invite or didn't get wasn't high on people's radar, but one team fell in love with them. So I do remember that in college. They said all you need is one team to fall in love with you that doesn't want you to go past that round. They have to get you now. So
now I've also been told, Roman, and this is by people that cover this, nobody in the building or at any other building in the NFL, that sometimes teams will purposely not vote for a guy to go to the combine because they think they have some like secret guy that they think is really good and they don't want the rest of the league to see him test really well at the combine. And they're like, I'm going to put it in my back pocket and maybe I don't want to find out about this guy.
Well, I know that's probably when Belichick was at the Patriots. There were a couple of teams I'd hear about that. They have their own, and they'd out of nowhere just draft some guy that no one knew about, and then the person becomes a productive player. I actually think the Patriots drafted like a D lineman, I think 2 years ago. It's a Division II player, like in the 5th or 6th round. But yeah, I've heard things like that. It's pretty funny, but I mean, there's so much information out on guys now that there aren't any secrets. If you're thinking like that as a team, I would imagine at least 10 other teams have the same thought about the guy.
I would imagine that is definitely the case. I imagine this was probably one of the toughest years to narrow down for the combine, Roman. I know you're not involved in that process necessarily, but given this is the last year for the COVID extra year, right, that there's a huge volume of players eligible for this year's draft class. I know it's a particular deep draft class. There's a lot of really good players. I got to imagine narrowing that combine number down this year was particularly tough.
Yeah, I think so. Especially, like I said, your top 100 guys are top 100 guys. But I think the guys that get that you get the challenge are guys that are highly productive, and they're on the border. And then here comes the junior that comes out, and that person automatically jumps you. So there's less juniors, and it actually balances itself out. If you imagine there's less juniors coming out and more 5th and 6th year seniors, next year it might come back to balance the way it used to be. But again, the one good thing about that, John, I would say this year, I think there were 3,500 college football guys playing with degrees on the field with degrees. So yes, NIL and all those things are good, but it's good to have a degree, and it's good to be able to manage yourself socially and all those things you learn on a college campus, because you're actually more likely to be a better professional once you actually get a contract. If you've learned how to manage your life, and then if you manage your life well, football take care of itself. So it was encouraging to see all the guys with degrees on
I
the
know,
field.
and I know you're working a lot with Ronnie Barnes, right, on the Combine NIC board.
Yes, absolutely.
What is Ronnie's role in that?
Just Ronnie Barnes along with Reggie Scott. Just any of the medical changes or any medical, always looking to do things better. The wait time for MRIs at the combine, all that thing that leads to the player experience. And obviously, Ronnie's got more years in athletic training than most people. So some of those things go to Ronnie Barnes. Some of the things that are club related may go to the GMs and some of the owners on the call. And then me and another lady, Anyaka in the Lamptey, she's the head of clinical wellness. We deal with like player assessments, player experience, drills, some of those things. But Ronnie has such a breadth of knowledge, and he's got so much credibility of league, other clubs, PFATs, the trainers associations, and all those things. A lot of people look up to Ronnie, so it's awesome to be teammates with him in a new locker room, so to speak.
Now, we've had some schedule changes at the Combine, Roman. You talked about trying to make this experience as good for the players as possible. You want to allow them to test as well as they possibly can. But there's also a TV event, right? So you have to balance kind of those two things together. So how has those conversations gone in terms of making that schedule work for everybody involved in that event at the same time?
Yeah, I think as long as the what's first and foremost is the players' experience and the players being able to test well. I know there were some narratives that were floating around that it's hard to interview all day, then run a 40 at night, and I think it's still the same schedule of arrive, administrative, medical, interview, then test. I think a lot of players would say, like, you show up in shape and then you don't run for 3 days and you think, oh man, I'm out of shape. You're not out of shape after 3 days. But I think the schedule changes have been positive, even down to what players are eating, time off, limiting time on interviews has been a big change. You can't just hold a guy hostage for an hour. If an interview is 15 minutes, there's like a clock on the wall, and you've got a guy from 9 to 9:15, then 9:15 to 9:30, then the interview's over. So teams are knowing that they have to adjust now, because again, any extra wait time, whether it's an interview took too long or it took too long to get an MRI, that always leads to a negative experience, and then you're less likely to get guys having a positive experience about the combine.
If you want to know how to manage 2 minutes of crunch time football, I'm your man. But if you're wondering about a long-term financial plan, you should talk to Citizens. Hey, I can also talk lawn care.
I'd like to learn about a mowing routine.
Yes, I knew I could help. Make sense of your money with Citizens.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought up the interview process, because I know that has changed a lot. And I've heard stories from some of the old heads, and I'm sure as a player you were involved in this, right? The old train station, where players are at the train station at the hotel,
Yeah.
and like I've heard stories where like team personnel like are fighting over guys, and like they're getting into shouting matches and fighting matches about who gets to interview the players. What have you guys done to kind of streamline that whole process, like you kind of just talked about?
Well, if you look at inside Lucas Oil Stadium, there's little suites, and every club has their own suite. So the interviews are done there. It's a friendly environment. I think one of the things that coming from the league office is always that players need to be treated with the utmost respect and dignity during that process. It's an HR interview for all practical purposes on behalf of the player and behalf of the club. So the clubs can't ask certain questions that make a player uncomfortable. Some players may have a legal issue that you may have to deal with, and you just have to address it. But you can't double down on some negative issue. You can't double down on a player's childhood or upbringing or some things that really fall really far outside the scope of the football, the X's and O's, how a player learns. And John, I would say most players come from humble beginnings and come from, maybe some challenging issues. And many good players come from that. And most players are good guys, and sometimes negative things happen. You've got to address that. But I think there's been a concerted effort to make sure that players and clubs understand that this is to be a professional environment on both sides. You don't want the kid coming in. I remember my combine experience. I mean, sitting in front of Bill Cowher. I mean, that was the year they lost the Super Bowl to the Cowboys, and after the '95 season. And they're asking me to draw up a play, and I'm nervous, and I draw up a play, backside of power. What does the tackle do? Another team may ask you about your childhood, about your background. You're from a single mom. How does that help you? So every team is different in how they respond, how they ask questions, which they're perfectly allowed to do. But again, it's the part about doubling down on a specific issue or trying to break a player, so to speak, mentally about how the person thinks. And I don't think a lot of clubs do that at all, but I think it's just the transparency about what the priorities are important to convey to players and to clubs alike. And obviously their agents know that too because they're the clients of these players.
All right, Rome, before we say goodbye, anything else you want to get out there about this process, the All-Star games, the combine, and just making sure these players go through this process as successfully as possible? We even talked about the 30 visits. You could talk about that if you want. And just to make sure what you guys are doing allows them to put their best foot forward.
I think one thing I didn't mention is we do talk a lot with the NCAA on some of the rules, junior declaration dates. The national championship date was I have a son, Howard Crosby, both two former Giants guys have sons that played for Notre Dame. They played 16 games this year. They played all the way up until January 20th. So that affects the offseason schedule as well. So some of those things aren't done in conjunction with the NCAA. So just want to let the viewers know that none of this is done in a vacuum. It's by committee, work with the NCAA. We want college football to thrive. We want players to do well and do their best, and that includes staying in school. So we're not making decisions based on superficial things or TV, what makes sense for television, what makes sense for network, but no, it's what makes sense for the integrity of the event, the clubs doing the evaluating, and obviously the players having a good experience overall.
All right, I got to ask you about RJ before we say goodbye here, Rome. He is going through this process. How is it going for him? I had a chance to talk to him down at the Senior Bowl. You guys go back to, on the audio podcast feed for the Huddle. You can find that interview in one of those Senior Bowl interview episodes. How's it going for him? And how are you handling it as a dad, man? I'm sure this is extremely stressful for you. You don't want to get too heavily involved. He's like, Dad, I can do it. And I'm sure he doesn't want you all up in his business. How has this whole experience been for you as a dad of a prospect?
It's gone pretty well. He's pretty mature. He's pretty mature. He's probably more mature than I was at that age for sure. But I didn't have a dad in the business telling me about things. I'm a little bit of a stickler on the interview. I think today's generation of kids, they don't communicate as well as like, I mean, you grew up in the world where you look at a guy in the eye, shake his hand, yes sir, no sir. I come from that world, so he didn't want to hear any 90s references by any means, but it's good to see him, and as any parent, I mean, whether your kid's playing the trumpet or something, the band in fourth grade, or they're at the Senior Bowl, I mean, you're just proud that they've taken ownership in things that they want to do well. It's a tough process, and he's probably considered a day 3 guy, fifth, sixth round, something like that. And so hopefully for him, I care about just a good organization, that he goes to a good organization that has stability, coaching, GMs, all those things, because then he could come in, learn, and develop. But again, one thing I've heard that he's done really well in the interviews last week during the Senior Bowl. So the character of the interviews, and when you hear things like he's a smart player, works hard, and cares about football, comes in the building early, leaves late. I mean, I think as someone with an offensive line mentality, I think it's good to hear that, because you want more D linemen and DBs having that mentality than just offensive linemen. So I'm happy for him, and I'm always here to support. But yeah, I'm probably a little bit more of a sticker on the interviews more than anything, because that's when they really get to know you. And I'm sure a few teams asked him, like, what did he learn from having a dad that played in the NFL? And he talked about preparation and always taking football seriously and being in places early and all those things. So I'm happy for him.
How much do you guys like work technique with like O-line, D-line, stuff like that, where you like, teach him how to, work offensive linemen, because you can obviously talk from that perspective?
Oh, all the time, all the time. I mean, he had a big sack against Georgia in the semifinal. And I remember usually the night or two before the game, I'll talk to him. I said, what are you seeing on film from these offensive line? Are they leaners? Are they big guys? Are they technicians? Are they athletes? You got to prepare differently against each guy. And as he's gotten older into college, we have less of those discussions because he's developed his own method of that. But he said, look, I could probably beat this guy for 2 or 3 sacks if I get that opportunity, because he's a leaner. I'm better with my hands, and he had a big strip sack in the second half of the Georgia game. Second quarter rather. And so it's good to, as kids get older, it's not always your idea, but it's like, what is your idea? And just taking ownership of something you believe in, and then just listen to how they go through it. And then you say, okay, that makes sense. But would you also consider X, Y, or Z? And so it's a different discussion than when you're 17. I'm like, okay, bull rush this guy. No, do a spin move because this guy oversets. But as he gets older, he's taking a lot more ownership. So no, I'm definitely proud and want him to do. But he's a technician now. He would tell you that he's a technician.
Well, I'll tell you, man. Like, I don't know who would not expect him to interview while he went to Duke and Notre Dame. I mean,
Yeah.
great job out of you. I mean, that's two fantastic schools. I think you
Yeah.
know he's going to be a smart player. He's going to interview well, given the two schools he went to, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just the environment they're in. I mean, some of those kind of schools, like even any player from like those schools, your Northwestern, your Vandy's, Boston College. I mean, you're living with regular students in the dorm when you're young. You're not just hanging around football players. You have other interests. That's encouraged. So you have a more worldview of the world versus just the football part of it. But no, I'm glad that he's done well for himself academically and whatever he earns on the field on Sundays. I mean, that's one thing I tell him all the time. You got to earn it on Sundays. I said, no GM is going to get fired because they drafted Roman Oben's kid. I said, you're going to have to earn every dollar, every down, every training camp rep, every preseason rep. You're going to have to earn it.
Once you're in the building, nothing else matters. That's absolutely
Yeah,
right. Roman,
100%.
this was fun, man. Thanks so much for doing it. And it was always good catching up with you. And I'll see you at the combine in Indy, I'm assuming, in a couple weeks.
Yep, I'll see you there.
Oh, awesome. Roman Oben works for the NFL, and now former Giant, of course. That's Roman Oben. Thanks for joining us on the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. We'll see you next time, everybody.